there's a kind of caricature neoliberal version of this where you say, actually, no, this is just revealed preferences. People don't dislike Facebook. If they did, they'd have left, right? In the same way that, like, if you sell your kidney for rent, you have a revealed preference for one kidney, right? But if you acknowledge that people sometimes make hard choices, and those hard choices arise out of like policy frameworks, right? Like if you have no tenancy protections, then people might have to sell their kidneys for rent. And if you allow firms to exclude new market entrants, purchase their competitors, engage in a raft of sleazy conduct, spy on their users, and so on, then they might be able to lock their users in long past the time when they would have left.
So a far less catchy phrase for enshittification would be a race to the bottom. And I'm always curious, broadly speaking, why this happens. I mean, if you believe in the beautiful version of capitalism, it's supposed to lead to a race to the top, where companies compete to do better and to make better products in order to do better in the market. And it seems in your book and in your telling of this that these were deliberate strategies taken by companies in order to allow the process of enshittification. And if it was deliberate, why? Is it just easier that way than it is to compete? And what fundamental forces enable the race to the bottom?
Yeah, so I actually don't think it was internal forces. I don't think it's endogenous. I think it's exogenous. I think endogenously, the pressure on firms is to lower the amount of money you spend on products, lower the amount of money you give to workers and suppliers, and maximize the amount of money retained by the firm. But in a state of nature, a firm cannot charge infinity dollars and pay $0 to its workforce unless it's an academic publisher, in which case that is how it operates. And the thing that prevents firms from doing this is the fear of a competitor. But of course, we stopped enforcing antitrust law. We stopped preventing horizontal mergers. But we also didn't want to enforce vertical mergers either. We subscribed to industrial organization theory that said vertical mergers were uniquely safe. The only time the state should intervene in a merger is if we know for sure that the merger is intended to be anti-competitive. And of course, if you don't want to ever prevent a merger, that's a great standard, because how will you ever find out what the intention of a tech boss is? Unless, of course, that tech boss is Mark Zuckerberg, who never had an illegal impulse he didn't commit to email that was later discovered by a prosecutor. And so Mark Zuckerberg sent an email at like 2:30 in the morning to his CFO that was like, yeah, we are buying Instagram. The reason we're spending $1 billion on a company with 12 employees, which you seem to think is crazy, is because people are leaving Facebook and going to Instagram and not coming back. So we'll recapture those users here. This is like sending a memo that says, like, Bob, that guy we were talking about killing, just so you know, it's definitely going to be a murder. And I was just thinking about it. I'm probably premeditating it right now, right? And yet the Clinton administration waved that merger through, right?
Obama administration. Obama,
I beg your pardon. You're right. No, the Obama administration. Yes, it would be amazing if the Clinton administration waved that merger through. And so, this is like, we had just no competition law enforcement, and we got monopolies. And, you folks working for an economics podcast might appreciate just how frustrating it is for someone like me to hear economists describe the cartelization of every sector in our economy as being unrelated to the pro-monopoly policies of economics, right? It's like we used to not have a rat problem and we were putting down rat poison. And then like these guys came along and said, you probably don't need the rat poison. You should stop putting it down. And now rats are eating our faces off. And they're like, well, why are you blaming me? Right? Maybe it's like sunspots that created the time of the rat and made them more fecund than at any time in history. And of course, it is true the rats did buy the rat poison factories and shut them down. But so what? We're not using rat poison. That's like an economically rational outcome. This is like Pareto optimal, And so we stop enforcing competition, and then like we lose another source of discipline, which is regulation. And, we think of these as separate domains, but the collective action problem that 100 SMEs have goes away when it's a cartel of 5 companies. They can decide on what they're going to tell their regulator. They're not engaged in what Peter Thiel calls a wasteful competition. So they have lots of free cash flow that they can devote to policy entrepreneurship. And they can make their policy preferences felt. And so, why are so many of the tech monopolies making so much money from spying on us? Well, maybe it's because we haven't passed a new privacy law since 1988, when Ronald Reagan got so angry about Robert Bork's video rental history being leaked to the newspapers that he signed a law that bans video rental history disclosure without permission. And that's the last privacy violation that Congress has seen fit to prohibit, right? So like regulatory capture, right? And then, we had other forms of regulation that firms didn't avoid, but rather mobilized, like IP law. And when they cartelized, they were able to weaponize the IP law in order to protect their cartels. And then they had to worry about their workforce because their workforce is very strong because they were valuable. But then when you have a cartel, they can gang up on their workers too. And eventually supply meets demand. You see 500,000 tech layoffs in the last 3 years. This endless, like disgustingly horny talk about AI replacing programmers, which is really just, AI doesn't do software engineering. It just writes little chunks of code. Software engineering is the thing that requires a lot of context, which is the thing that AI cannot do. You cannot get a large language model to think really hard about what happened before and what's going to happen afterwards and what's happening adjacently, because that is geometrically more computationally expensive than just writing one routine. And so, it's not that they think they're going to replace programmers with AI. It's that they think they're going to frighten programmers by talking about replacing them with AI. And so the power of programmers gets broken too. And then we just end up in a situation where the guys who get up every morning in the suite, go to the C-suite, grab the giant lever on the wall marked enshittification and pull it as hard as they can, no longer have it gummed up by competitors or regulators or interoperability or an empowered workforce. It just moves very freely. It's been totally lubricated by policy choices. And then we get enshittification.
Of course, you're right. The incentives are to pay the least and to sell at the highest price possible, etc. And the big insight of Adam Smith is that competition fixes these problems and delivers desirable outcome. However, the competition that Adam Smith is talking about is competition on prices or on quality. And very often competition takes different forms. And those don't deliver the same good outcome that Adam Smith predicted. So if we are competing in trying to make it more difficult to leave the jail in which we have the customer in, or if we are competing trying to make it difficult for you to leave and choose somebody else, that's a terrible competition, is very destructive. And this is where I think the antitrust authorities should intervene massively, because this is clearly incredibly welfare destroying. And this is when Google is making its product worse in order to make more money. This is like unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
And this is what the problem is, that I think economists have not recognized, and of course policymakers even more so, how devastating this dimension is.
Yeah, I think that's well put. And I do think that this is an area where like the neo-Brandeisians sometimes have a blind spot, where competition for its own sake gets reified. So I remember there was an op-ed in The Sling, which is a excellent publication, written by this guy who works for one of the advocacy groups, like ad industry groups in the UK, who was talking about attribution. So this is a thing that the ad industry is totally obsessed with. It is the idea that after I show you an ad programmatically, I follow you around in the physical world. I look at all of your credit card transactions, and I look at everything you do on the internet until I figure out whether you bought the thing that I showed you the ad for. And this is a thing that Google and Meta are uniquely suited to do. It's one of those things you do get returns to scale from, and smaller firms cannot, and so they can't compete, right? And so the point of this industry lobbyist, who also managed to sneak something into one of the Competition Markets Authority's reports, the one on ad tech, is that this is an unfair competitive advantage, and we should address it by making it easier for smaller firms to do attribution. And his answer to this is assigning every Briton a permanent advertising identifier at birth that can be used to track all their actions. And it's the most insane goddamn thing. But if if you believe in competition as an end instead of as a means, right? I think of competition as embodying John Sherman's idea that if we would not have a king, we shouldn't have an autocrat of trade. That what we want to do is not allow, a inbred, merged cartel that's they've screwed so many of each other that they've got a corporate Habsburg jaw to like just take over our sector and structure our markets and our lives. And I want competition to turn them into a rabble who are at each other's throats so that we can have effective regulation. And I say this to my libertarian friends all the time. Look, even if you like are so like Elon Musk addled that your copy of the Fountainhead can no longer be read because the pages are all stuck together, and the only thing that you think that a regulator should do is enforce contracts, they still have to be powerful enough to enforce contracts, right? They have to be more powerful than the entities they're enforcing the contracts among. The referee has to be able to boss the players around, otherwise they won't play by the rules. And so the smallest government you're ever going to get is going to be determined by the largest corporation you're willing to tolerate. And so even if you're a small government person, I think you should want, sectors organized around SMEs and not around large dominant firms. I mean, IBM was in antitrust litigation with the DOJ for 12 consecutive years. And every year it outspent the entire DOJ on outside counsel to fight the DOJ antitrust division, right? When a corporation can outspend the federal government for 12 consecutive years, it's going to be really hard to stop it from cheating.
So another version of this question, and I think your views on this might have changed over time, is do enshittified firms die, or when do they die?
Yeah.
And is it simply the speed of enshittification, like the proverbial frog in the boiling water? And for some reason, I think you've become, reading your work makes me think that you've become more cynical over time, that you once maybe believed that enshittified firms did die, and now you think they might be vampiric and they might have life forever. Am I right about that? And is there any line or any sort of set of characteristics you can draw to say when they might meet their deserved fate?
So I call them zombies and not vampires, but otherwise I agree. I think that they're well past the time we should have double tapped them and stuffed them in a shallow grave, but that we struggle to. We're trapped in their rotting carcasses. And I guess when I wrote initially in that first blog post that, and then they die, that it was more wish casting than anything. I think that like they're not bad at finding the minimum quantum of value that will keep us stuck there, at least until they don't, right? At least until something exogenous happens that tips the equilibrium from I hate this place, but I can't stop using it, and I hate this place and I'm not going to use it anymore. And so far they've been able to often recover from that. Facebook has had several of these live stream mass shootings and, other things that have provoked bolts for the exits, and sometimes has provoked like weird strategy changes at Facebook, like Mark Zuckerberg announcing that the future wouldn't consist of arguing with your most racist uncle using the primitive text interface that he created in his Harvard dorm to non-consensually rate how bangable the fellow undergrads were, but rather that he was going to convert you and everyone you love into a legless, sexless, low polygon, heavily surveilled cartoon character so he can imprison you in a virtual world he stole from a 25-year-old cyberpunk novel he called The Metaverse. But, for the most part, these firms have hung on despite these missteps. And I think that should alarm us, right? I think that there's like there's a kind of caricature neoliberal version of this where you say, actually, no, this is just revealed preferences. People don't dislike Facebook. If they did, they'd have left, right? In the same way that like if you sell your kidney for rent, you have a revealed preference for one kidney, right? But if you acknowledge that people sometimes make hard choices, and those hard choices arise out of like policy frameworks, right? Like if you have no tenancy protections, then people might have to sell their kidneys for rent. And if you allow firms to exclude new market entrants, purchase their competitors, engage in a raft of sleazy conduct, spy on their users and so on, then they might be able to lock their users in long past the time when they would have left. And the thing that I worry about now is not whether these firms will die, because I think they will eventually. It's the harm they'll do on the way and the harm they'll do when they go. Because the thing that you really want, especially in these social platforms, but also in other platforms like banks and so on, is you want to evacuate them. You don't want them to just collapse, right? Like there are lots of very bad banks. And one of the reasons we step in when those banks are failing, rather than allowing them to just fail, is that the depositors suffer substantial harms if we just allow nature to take its course. And in the same way, people on Facebook are there because they have really important social relationships with each other. It's why they're still there. In fact, it's the great tragedy of Facebook is they have weaponized the things that matter most to us. And they are always seeking an equilibrium where the harms from losing everything Facebook gives you are just slightly outweighed by the harms Facebook is choosing to inflict on you to benefit its shareholders. And that's why I think this is a policy matter and not a matter of us shopping incorrectly or even the wickedness of Facebook's management.
So Bethany and I had a debate about what is actually new behind this idea of enshittification. Um, because some of the ideas are around in economics. What is special about it?
Well, as you say, I think that a lot of this exists in the economics literature. I would say that I do identify sectoral characteristics of tech that I don't think are well explored elsewhere. And those would be the unique composition of the tech labor force, in that they are quite powerful despite not being unionized because of the scarcity and because of their productivity. There's an NBER paper that estimated that the average tech worker in Silicon Valley was adding $1 million a year to the firm's bottom line. So when you have a worker who's very scarce and is worth $1 million a year, you treat them very well, and those workers themselves, often their path into tech involved having a kind of revelatory life experience with tech, where they discovered their community, they discovered their politics, they discovered a way out of what seemed like a predestined life, and so they often want to give that to everyone else. So they cared about their users. And then there's this one other characteristic that is distinct to this that I think has been very under theorized in the economics literature, which is the role that interoperability plays, specifically as it relates to digital computers, right, which have a kind of interoperability on steroids, in as much as the only computer we know how to make is the Turing complete universal von Neumann machine that literally can run every program. And not only is that what all our computers are, but we do not know how to make a computer that only runs some programs, which means that every 10-foot pile of shit in an app you use has an 11-foot ladder that can go straight over it. And so historically, the fact that interoperability would allow new market entry at very low capitalization to alienate the affections of customers, right? You block third-party ink, I make the thing that lets you install third-party ink, and that can lead to new market entry at low capitalization that just scoops up the business of incumbent firms. You block third-party ink in your printer, and someone else comes along and offers me the tool that lets me unlock that and put in their generic ink. The cost of materials for ink is a penny a gallon. The retail price of ink is $10,000 a gallon. That's a lot of margin that you can play with, even if you have to spend some of it on like keeping up to date with jailbreaking every make and model of every printer as it gets updated. I might just buy my next printer from that ink company. And so it created a great deal of dynamism. And in the arguments about the expansion of black letter IP law and its enforcement and interpretation, arguments about how that would foreclose on market entry were not taken very seriously by policymakers. They just had this idea that stronger IP laws necessarily created more capital formation, and that capital formation would result in innovation. And the fact that it would allow incumbent firms to block interoperability, this engine of dynamism in technology, was just completely ignored by economists and by politicians alike.
One of the parts I love of your book is the story about Bruce Lehman and how we got subtle, to use it, with the IP law we have now.
Yeah. So Bruce Lehman, he was, I don't know if it's Lehman or Lehman. I've always said Lehman, like Lehman Brothers, but maybe it was Lehman. Maybe it was Lehman Brothers. Bruce Lehman was the IP czar for Bill Clinton. And Bruce Lehman went to him and said, we're going to need a new IP law for the internet. And that IP law should ban all modification of devices or services unless the manufacturer approves of them, even if you're doing it for a purpose that is otherwise lawful. So if you're modifying your car that has been designed so that you can only interpret the check engine light if you're paying the manufacturer for a check engine light interpreting tool, which is a thing that every mechanic today is paying for, $10,000 per manufacturer per year. And if you modify that car so that it just takes any check engine light modification tool, that should be illegal, right? Modification without the consent of the manufacturer should be illegal. And Al Gore thought, to his credit, this was a terrible idea, and he told Bruce Lehman to go pound sand. So Bruce Lehman went to the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, in Geneva. It's the specialized UN agency that makes copyright laws. They have the relationship to bad copyright law that Mordor has to evil in Middle-earth, right? Every bad law emanates from them. And they passed two laws, the WIPO Copyright Treaty and the WIPO Performers and Phonograms Treaty, which are collectively known as the Internet Treaties. And these contained this provision. And then Bruce Lehman went back to Congress and he said, well, now it's an obligation, right? This is no longer a proposal, it's a requirement. And in 1998, Bill Clinton signed the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which embodies these proposals that had been rejected by the administrative branch. And Bruce Lehman subsequently gave many speeches where he described this as, quote, doing an end run around Congress. So, that's how we got these first anti-circumvention laws. And you can see why the US would want them, right? Because they were going to both have firms that domestically produced technologies that could extract rent by having these anti-circumvention tools and therefore return more money to their shareholders. But also they would export these around the world, and that these tools would become a system for America to extract rent from its trading partners. But it's harder to see why those trading partners wanted it, right? Why sign up to this? And the answer is the US Trade Representative said, if you don't do it, we're going to hit you with tariffs. And so everywhere you look, basically every country that has advanced technical capabilities has signed up to make it illegal to modify things. And there are some European firms that have taken advantage of this to extract their own rents. It's not good though, right? Like one of the reasons Dieselgate happened is because anti-circumvention creates a zone of legal jeopardy for security auditing. Because if you open up the software in like a car engine to find out how it works, and there's like a digital lock that you have to break to get there, well, then that's a crime. And so no one wanted to audit a Mercedes or a Volkswagen engine to see whether they were gaming their diesel emissions outcomes. This killed thousands of Europeans a year. Today, Mercedes uses it. They sell you your accelerator pedal. So you buy a top of the line Mercedes, but it doesn't go as fast as the engine can unless you buy a monthly subscription. There's another European firm that uses this. It's a company called Medtronic. They're the largest med tech company in the world. They're nominally Irish. They're really American. They did the largest tax inversion in history, but not before buying every other med tech company. So they make all the ventilators.
They use a thing. They're actually Minnesotan, in fact. So they're close to Canadian, which might actually be great. But anyway,
that might be that. Yeah. Minnesota. This is the definition of Minnesota nice. So they broke the ventilators so that if you put a part in a ventilator, a good part, the ventilator won't recognize it until you pay for a service call out and an unlock step. And it's against the law to bypass that. And during the lockdowns, hospitals were nursing their ventilators along and doing things like taking a donor screen out of a dead ventilator and putting it in a working ventilator with a dead screen, but it wouldn't work because Medtronic uses these software locks that are against the law to bypass. My favorite example, there's a Polish train manufacturer called Newag, N-E-W-A-G, and they sabotage their locomotives. So the locomotives are continuously checking to see where they're parked. And if they find that they've been parked in a service yard belonging to a rival train servicing company, the locomotive immobilizes itself and cannot be started again. And you call up Newag and you say, my locomotive is broken. And they say, oh, well, let us do some remote diagnostics. And then they say, oh, we found your problem. That will be 20,000 euros to reset it. And it turns out that it was just a software bomb in the train. And the security researchers who were hired by a Polish train operator to find out why their trains kept doing this, when they published this result and made this public, Newag threatened them with liability under Article 6 of the Copyright Directive because they had to bypass the software locks to find the sabotage in the locomotive, right? So getting rid of this in Europe should be a no-brainer because it's not like any Europeans are happy about the firms that in Europe, the handful of firms that are using it. They're all using it in terrible ways. There are no good ways to use a prohibition on the owners of devices deciding how they work. That's just not a legitimate thing.
So you said something super interesting that I never heard before, which tariffs were threatened unless you agree on the IP law. So Trump was not the first one to threaten tariffs for political reasons. He said, oh, this is a new thing that Trump is doing.
Look, I mean, I think that the biggest impediment to a sovereign, safe European digital sphere has been the fear of having tariffs imposed on them. And when I was European director of EFF, I worked in more than 30 countries, and everywhere I went, everyone I spoke to said, your policy prescriptions sound very good, and we have no doubt that they would be beneficial to our economy and to our people's thriving, but they wouldn't be beneficial enough to offset the costs of having tariffs imposed on us by the US. I used to teach and sometimes in the summer at CEU in Budapest in an international relations program. And a lot of my doctoral candidates were former government officials from around the world. And one of my students was someone who had been the information minister for a Central American country during the Central American Free Trade Agreement negotiations with the US. And they described getting a call from their negotiator saying, I know you told us not to cave on anti-circumvention with the trade rep, but they will not take our agricultural exports if we do not sign up to anti-circumvention. And so now they're already not able to send their agricultural exports. And they have an excellent technical university in the capital. And if they were to pick just one line of business where the US is extracting tons of rent, like automotive diagnostics, right, and made a tool that was $25 a month that every mechanic in the world could buy, that would be costless to export, right? The unit economics are incredible, right? It's just a piece of software you're exporting. Your ongoing capex is just like, you buy every car as it comes off the line, you install every software update when it's pushed out, and then you jailbreak it. You could make billions of dollars in a software export market. And, being a Canadian, I remember what it meant when we had one company that was successful, right? We had Research in Motion, and it spun out an entire regional tech sector. Look at what happened to Finland when it stopped being the sick man of Europe, and its leading rubber boot manufacturer, Nokia, started making phones instead, right? These are gigantic opportunities for countries around the world. And, Americans, and I'm at present time living in America, I have American citizenship now. Americans won't be left out by this. In the same way that we can buy reasonably priced pharmaceuticals from Canada, we could buy those digital tools. So long as we had a payment method and an internet connection, we could be unshackling our phones and our cars and our printers, our games consoles, our ventilators, our tractors from control by American monopolists. Because when you look at how much stock everyone who's not in the top decile owns, right, and therefore a number of Americans who benefit from the stock gains, the superior cash position of firms that do this rent extraction, it's nothing, right? Almost all of us would benefit from cutting off these rent-seeking arrangements.
So you are an activist that who is very attentive to the so-called theory of change. So my question is, I think that this phase of enshittification actually creates some opportunities for change, because at the beginning, when most customers were getting all this product for free and were novel and were happy, it was very hard to sell them on, we should limit Google, we should limit Facebook. But now that they start to see the real nature of these big tech giants, I think there is a real opportunity for a popular movement of antitrust. Do you agree with this?
I think there is a real moment for antitrust. I think it's already happening. I actually think this is one of the great under-theorized areas of political science in this moment, because you've probably seen the studies that look at empirical data on policy outcomes and compare them to attitudes among different groups in the population, and conclude, bluntly, that things that billionaires want happen and things that billionaires don't want don't happen. And the exception to this is antitrust. And it's not just happening here, and not just happening under Biden. It started under Trump 1. It's happened obviously in the European Union, but also in the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, and not under radical labor. It wasn't Jeremy Corbyn who kicked off their antitrust enforcement. It was a string of Tory governments, each more shambolic than the last, including the one that didn't outlast a head of lettuce. And yet they did more work in 5 years at the Competition and Markets Authority than they had under in the previous 50. Canada had the weakest competition regulator in the world. Our competition bureau had only attempted to stop 3 mergers and had never succeeded in stopping a merger. And then in 2024, Justin Trudeau whipped his caucus to give them the most far-reaching enforcement powers of any competition regulator in the world, and he gave them a budget to use those new powers. We've also seen, big antitrust swings in Australia, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, but also in China, right, where the cyberspace directive prohibits Chinese tech giants from blocking interoperability by new market entrants in China, because contrary to everything Nick Clegg said, China doesn't use its tech companies as a way to project power around the world. China views those companies as a competitor for power at home and internationally, and wants to chop those firms down to size. So, this is quite remarkable as a political science matter. It is as though like gravity was repealed, water started flowing upwards, and the skies filled with flying, political science pigs, and nobody noticed, right? Like we're just like, oh, that's quite a curiosity. It's neo-Brandeisians. Somehow Tim Wu has changed everyone else's minds. Tim and I went to elementary school together, so I've known him all my life. He is very persuasive, but he's not that persuasive. And I don't think anyone understands it. I don't claim to understand it. It is a remarkable new fact on the ground. I think that you don't even have to understand why it's happening to understand that when there is a tailwind this strong, it's time to unfurl your sails.
It's funny. The first question I meant to ask you at the beginning of the podcast was about Tim, and if there was something in the water where the two of you grew up that shaped the way you think. And also if your thinking does diverge on any points, because in reading his book and your book, Enshittification, The Age of Extraction, they're similar themes in some ways. Are there places when you guys sit down together over a drink of brown liquor, do you fight? Or are there places you disagree, or do you find yourself pretty simpatico?
I mean, I think I would say broadly, Tim views market economies as an end to themselves, or at least as something optimal or optimizable. And I think of markets. I don't know if you know the economist John T. Harvey, but he talks about markets as a tool. And he says, it'd be very weird if you met a carpenter who said, no, I only use screwdrivers. Right. And there's no way I'm going to use a hammer. Right. That's just immoral. What are you, a communist? And I think of markets as a tool. I think the case for markets comes and goes based on historic contingency, but I don't think they're the most important tool we have. And I don't know. There's a very good book called The People's Republic of Walmart that revisits the socialist calculation debate in Vienna in the 1920s, where you had Hayek and von Mises saying, well, like you could just never build a computer big enough to build a command economy the size of the Soviet Union. And the point of the authors is that Walmart is an economy the size of the Soviet Union, and it's a command economy. And so at the very least, like we can say that, like as a technical matter, you can run a command economy that is the right order of magnitude to be a powerful nation state. Whether or not you want to is a separate matter. But like part of the argument against planning in industrial policy has been that it's just a technical nonsense. And yet, you have Walmart and not just Walmart, right? But Walmart is such an important buyer that they tightly integrate with the supply chains of their key suppliers. So like when Walmart orders a bunch of toothpaste from Colgate Palmolive, they don't send them a PO. They schedule their production line, right? They reach into their production scheduling. This is like what they tried to do with the Soviet shipyards and steel mills, was to actually have like a joint management, so that when the shipyard needed more steel, they didn't place an order, they coordinated production. And that is in fact what Walmart does. They don't use price signals, right, to turn on more Colgate. They reach into their scheduling app and they summon their workers to the Colgate factory when they need toothpaste. So I'd say that that's our biggest difference, that like I'm at least willing to entertain. Maybe this is the difference between being a science fiction writer and an academic, is that I'm willing to entertain the possibility of a fascinating world where markets are less important and planning is more central. Although I also, I'm quite interested in how we can pluralize management of these things. I like the idea of municipal fiber, but I don't like the idea of Eric Adams being my ISP. And I think that, there are lots of ways that you can hybridize that. right? Like and I think this is maybe where Tim and I agree, where like you should have municipal fiber in municipal conduit, and anyone should be able to rent space in the municipal conduit to run their own fiber. And then the municipal data centers should have essential facility sharing, so anyone can rent a shelf in the data center if they don't want to run their own fiber, but they do want to be an ISP, where they can offer ISP services from the shelf in the municipal data center. And that way you have a kind of best of all worlds, where it's not just Eric Adams is your ISP or Victor Orban is your ISP, but rather you have the stuff that markets can't do, which is find an efficient way to clear the costs of digging up all the streets in your city and putting conduit in the ground, being handled by the state. And then a public option that acts as a check on the private sector, and then private options, including cooperative or nonprofit options, that act as a check on the state as well.
So you're a very prolific writer, and you write basically a book a year. And you're coming up next 2 books a year. Sorry.
Yeah.
So next year, one of the 2 books that you're coming out with is about AI. Can you give us a sneak preview of your view about AI?
Yeah, it's called The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI. And the title refers to 2, I think, important phenomena, one of which has to do with automation and labor economics. So in automation theory, a centaur is someone who's assisted by a machine, and a reverse centaur is someone who is conscripted to assist the machine, always at a pace that exceeds normal human tolerances, and always over timescales that exceed normal human endurance. And so machines don't just use humans, they use them up. So this is the story of an Amazon driver, Amazon warehouse worker, a therapist who's been conscripted to be the back end of 25 simultaneous conversations with a chatbot that's doing AI therapy, and has to be monitoring all of them and waiting for any of them to throw a flag and say, oh, this person has gotten into water that the chatbot can't handle. I think that the reason the title says Life After AI is that the economics of AI do not pencil out and can't be made to pencil out. That the economics of AI are grounded in the idea that you can displace labor, that you can just substitute algorithms for wages, and that if you add up all the wage bills that AI can zero out, it makes up for the $700 billion in capex that the firms have already committed to, and the hundreds of billions, or that they've already expended, and the hundreds of billions that they've committed to. Besides, it's a number that Bain estimates as $3 billion a year, or $3 trillion a year by 2030. I don't think we get there. I think when you look at the jobs AI can do, they're not high-waged jobs. They're jobs where it doesn't matter if people make mistakes, like AI porn and election disinformation. The wage bills for AI porn and election disinformation disrupts are like round to zero. The big demos that you can do with AI, like commercial illustration, which I also don't think is very good, but even if you like it, commercial illustrators are the most precaritized workers in America. Right? Like if you zero out all their wages and give them to Sam Altman, it won't pay for like the kombucha bill for the technicians overseeing a single training run of the next model, right? It's effectively zero. And meanwhile, all the things that we want AI to do, like teaching or driving or what have you, they only work in these reverse centaur configurations where you fire most of the people who do it. You put chatbots in charge of it. The chatbots make mistakes at a pace that the human can't possibly catch, that is being put in charge of babysitting the AI, but the human gets the blame, right? The human is the accountability sink. It's a sector that spent $700 billion so far, that claims to be making $60 billion a year sectorally. That number is grossly inflated, right? It includes OpenAI getting $10 billion worth of tokens from Microsoft for their cloud, and then giving them back to Microsoft, which Microsoft books as revenue, right? That's like you walking past a Starbucks and they hand you a coupon for a $7 latte, and you redeem it and they book $7 in revenue. Only it's $10 billion out of 60. They are depreciating their assets on a 5-year time scale. The GPUs are burning out in 2 to 3 years. The data centers are super specialized and optimized. It's not even clear whether they can accommodate the next generation of GPUs, much less, general purpose computers that can do other kinds of compute work. And they're passing around the same $100 billion IOU over and over again and pretending that it's new revenue. And 7 of those companies are 32% of the S&P 500. And so I think we are headed for a crash. I think that crash is going to be so big that 2008 will look like a utopia by comparison. And I think when it's over, in addition to whatever great political wreckage that creates, because those crashes are often attended by rises in authoritarian movements, I think we will have some productive residue that we can salvage. There'll be a lot of GPUs at 10 cents on the dollar. There'll be a lot of unemployed applied mathematicians and statisticians. And there'll be a lot of open source models that are going to outlive the companies that flip them over the wall as a kind of loss leader and calling card. And they'll have barely been optimized because the big AI companies, the way that they signal to the market that they're serious is by increasing their capex. They're basically making an investor proposition where they exploit this Byzantine premium where no one understands what they do. And so all they can understand is like the magnitude of what they're doing. And they're hoping that investors go, well, a pile of shit this big has got to have a pony under it somewhere. Right. And so there's just this opportunity to optimize these models that they have thus far had no interest in optimizing, and getting them to run on commodity hardware on premises to do interesting and useful things that are not going to result in $3 trillion worth of wage displacement, and certainly aren't going to make like a super intelligence, right? Teaching the word guessing program more words will not make it intelligent any more than breeding horses to run faster and faster will cause one of them to give birth to a locomotive, right? They're just not the same thing.
So the last question for you, as I was thinking about enshittification, and it's not quite the same process, but I couldn't help thinking of Isaac Asimov, and he in the Foundation where he writes why they don't even understand their own colossi any longer. The machines work from generation to generation automatically, and the caretakers are a hereditary caste who would be helpless if a single D-tube and all of that vast structure burnt out. So are you an Asimov fan, and is that the inevitable end result of enshittification?
I do like Asimov. My first short story was published in Asimov Science Fiction magazine, so I'm a fan of his. But I don't think that's what's going on. So one of the things I'm at great pains to do in this book is recover what I think of as kind of a suppressed history of policy choices that led to this place. I don't think it is mysterious. I don't think it's that the machines are black boxes that we don't understand. I think we said, let's not enforce antitrust law, and we got monopolies. I think we didn't pass privacy law, we got privacy invasions. I think tech workers had an opportunity to unionize when they were strong, and they said, no, I'm a temporarily embarrassed entrepreneur. Why would I need a union? And now they're like working for bosses who don't fear them anymore, and whose treatment for the workers they don't fear involves Apple factories with suicide nets around them and Amazon vans with pee bottles in them. And there's nothing about working in, with a computer that says that you can't have a pee bottle next to it. For a guy with his penis-shaped rocket, Jeff Bezos really does not like our kidneys. I think that like these are all choices. And Bruce Lehman's choice to create anti-circumvention law, the U.S. Trade Representative's choice to spread it around the world, they're not inevitable. They didn't come down off a mountain on 2 stone tablets. We can choose otherwise, right? We aren't prisoners of a black box. We're not trying to figure out how to like embalm a pharaoh or build a pyramid without power tools, right? We're just like saying, hey, that thing that we stopped doing, we could do it again, and that thing that we do, we could stop doing. And for that reason, I'm actually very hopeful.
It was fun, no?
It was really fun. Where do you agree with him about regulation, and where do you disagree? Do you think he puts too much weight on the failure of regulation and the failure of antitrust law, or does all of that 100% resonate with you?
So I think that there is a failure jointly of regulation and antitrust law. In a sense, these platforms do bring new problems. And I think new problems require some new thinking, or at least some clear thinking. And instead, we try to apply a framework that maybe was not even working before, but clearly doesn't work very well in the new world. And I love his emphasis on interoperability. I think that is, to me, the best solution, because is a technical solution and is a solution that favors freedom and competition. And I think there are limited ability to induce regulatory capture. Remember, we had the discussion with Tim Wu on this issue, and he's very skeptical about regulation. And I share some of that skepticism, except that if you're really trying to enforce a common standard and interoperability, I think that I see as the cost being much less, and the benefits being enormous. And what Cory said is very interesting. Is there is a general sympathy to antitrust, and he only, in my view, overestimated the impact that this had in the United States. Because while we have seen Jordan Cantor and Lina Khan being quite aggressive on the executive side of the branch, we saw no progress whatsoever on the legislative side of the equation. And I think that this might really be linked to what Tim Wu told us, is at the end of the day, the presidential election is the least corrupt by money, ironically, because it's the most visible one. And so it's the one where probably you can get somebody like Biden making a decision to appoint to people like Lina Khan and Jordan Kenter. While in Congress, all Congress people and all senators are really dependent on money, and they don't want to alienate the Silicon Valley industry.
I'm going to say perhaps the least cynical thing I've ever said, but I do wonder if there's another component to it other than money, in the sense that this movement toward understanding the failures of antitrust and the fact that it is enabling capitalists to not behave like capitalists actually anymore, per what Tim Wu said, is so dramatic. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it isn't such. If you look, it obviously did happen slowly, but the moment in which we realized it happened all of a sudden. And I think maybe some of our legislatures just actually haven't caught up. They're still trapped in a world in which American competition, enabling American greatness, meant enabling American companies to do whatever they wanted to, because those companies inevitably were going to operate for the good of society and for the world. And I think there might be a more fundamental human nature thing going on than just money.
I love this sort of non-cynicism of viewers, but I will reply with Afton Sinclair. It is very hard to convince people when their money depends on them not being convinced. And I think that that is, in my view. So I think that is to say, you are right that there is an ideology or a leftover an ideology that makes it more comfortable to sort of defend the status quo.
Yeah.
However, when they have the right incentives, they learn super fast. And when they don't have the right incentives, they never learn.
Anyway, I thought his ideas in contrast or in conjunction with Wu's are also really interesting. What did you think their areas of disagreement were, or maybe what did you think their areas of particular resonance were?
I think that my impression is that they, in the substance, on the substance, they disagree less than they claim they disagree. I think that they come from two very different perspectives. If I, my impression is that, and I'm kind of speak out of turn because I don't know all their intellectual history, but my impression of their intellectual history is that Cory is a leftist activist that has always been kind of more on the anarchic side, and has come to this dislike for big tech because of his fundamental saying libertarian now sounds very political, but you see what I mean, love for freedom and independence. And Tim Wu, I think, has more of a traditional, if you want, neoliberal formation. He was in the Obama administration, basically at the time where the Google deal that Cory was criticizing went through, and he did not raise any issue with that, and only later has changed. But I actually give a lot of credit to Tim to have changed, and I think that maybe their starting points are very different, but their ending point these days are not very different. Remember the basically very strong endorsement that Tim Wu gave of Zohar Mamdani. So I think that they end up in a pretty similar place.
That's really interesting, because I had thought, until you mentioned Tim's endorsement of Mamdani, I had thought that they actually were coming from pretty radically different places, in the sense that I see Tim as more of a believer in capitalism. He wants to save it from the capitalists, per your language, but he's a believer at his core in capitalism, at least in something closer to its ideal state. Whereas I think Cory very clearly is much more of a socialist slash communist, and doesn't even necessarily believe in the power of markets, or he says markets can be a tool, but just a tool and not even. And so I think in that way they are very, very different, but maybe I'm conflating some of Tim's prior views with his positions now, because I had forgotten until you mentioned it about his endorsement of Mamdani.
And maybe it's my mistake that I don't see sort of a Cory as such a communist. This
What?
is what?
Really? Oh, that's so
Yeah.
interesting. Didn't you think his example about how, which I wanted to get to because I'm not sure he was right, his example about how you could too run a command economy because Walmart runs a command economy. So criticisms of a communist style of running an economy aren't right because Walmart can run a command economy. I thought that very much betrayed, not betrayed, just showed a position.
I disagree. I think that I always say that basically a command economy is a firm, the firm, but Coase will agree with that. The example of a command economy is a firm. And so the fact that you can run large firms does suggest you can run a large economy. The big difference is that you have competition among those command economies, and that are called firms. You don't have competition when you have one command economy in your own country. I think that that's the big difference. I did not take, and maybe it's the way I read, I did not take this as an endorsement. You can that of a Soviet economy. Is more that the standard criticism that people make is superficial because there is a good counterexample.
Hmm. I did take it as more of an endorsement. So, but I might have to go back and listen to what he actually said, and see, we can decide, or our listeners can decide who's right. With the caveat that I might be wrong, and maybe I need to go back and listen to it again and hear it precisely in what context he meant his remark. I guess I heard it in the context of his overall skepticism about markets, and he did say they could be a tool, but definitely not the only tool. And so,
But I will
took a
subscribe
bit.
to that view. I would
I took,
subscribe to that view.
I
Markets are a very important tool.
and that's
It's
it.
you don't want the market everywhere.
No,
Uh,
definitely. Well, I think that's been some of our powerful episodes, and have shaped my thinking on that. That you don't want the market everywhere, for sure. It should stay in its correct sphere. So, okay, all right, all right. Well, we should have asked him that question. Is he outright? Are you a communist? Would you prefer that way of? Would you prefer that method of that method of running an economy? But do you think, I actually was interested in that? Do you think broadly that comparison is right? That because you can run a firm like Walmart as in a command way, you can run an economy that way? I'm not sure the two are comparable, not just from the standpoint of competition, but it does seem that the number of inputs is really, really different than and that the number of inputs in running any, just that I'm not sure that analogy holds. And I guess one reason I would think that it doesn't hold is that the number of inputs required to run an economy in a command way are exponentially more than the number of inputs required to run a firm in a command way. So I wasn't sure. I was thinking as he was saying it, I was trying to decide if I agreed with that analogy or not. Do you agree with it?
I actually think that, of course, depends on what country and which firm, but between the country of Bhutan and Boeing, I think Boeing is infinitely more complex than the country of Bhutan. The supply chain of Boeing is a nightmare. And the level of sophistication, I think this is actually one of the favorite questions I ask my students. I give them to as an assignment to read the famous piece by Hayek, The Use of Knowledge in Society. And then I asked them, I said, look, Hayek wrote in 1945, when of course there were no computers, or at least not computers at the level we have today. And so to what extent the existence of computers changes his reasoning, and to now I said what extent the surveillance economy we have and also the AI might change the answer. And I think actually, at the cost of giving away the answer, but at this point, ChatGPT does the same. Is the computers does not really change the equation very much, because Hayek was very careful in saying it's not just a computational issue. Okay, if it's only a computational issue, that can be resolved by computers. But in his view, is a transfer of knowledge issue, because the knowledge is diffuse, and so there is an incentive problem. But actually, if you really read, and I'm sorry to say I spend more time than I care to admit on that piece by Hayek, but if you really read carefully, he basically said that knowledge is not transferable. So almost by construction cannot be transferred. And so his idea is you need to delegate the actions to the individuals, because the individuals are the only one with the information, because that information is by definition not transferable. And so how do you coordinate them? You need prices to coordinate them. Okay? So it's not, most people say, Hayek say the price actually transfer information. No, price only coordinated the action of people who have a lot of information at the local level, and they cannot transfer that information. That is the advantage of a market economy, according to Hayek, which is to some extent not solved by the Walmart problem, because at the end of the day, the Walmart employee that has to make this, the Walmart employee cannot make decisions based on his local knowledge, or at least not fully, because he is forced by this command and control.
Interesting.
Sorry, I went overboard with my lecturing.
I found that totally fascinating. See, I can learn all the economics I never knew from you.